From Earth, Hand, and Heart, stories of preservation and restoration of New Mexico's adobe churches.
There's something altogether very sacred even about touching the woodwork or the adobe wall that was put there by someone a long time ago.
Next, on Colores.
Te salve María, llena eres de gracia, el Señor es contigo, bendita eres entre todas las mujeres y bendito sea el fruto de su vientre Jesús.
It seems to me that from the very beginning of time, people have always gathered together to express their faith in their God. Whether they were compelled by the awesome mystery of life itself, or overwhelmed by the awesome display of power in nature, people have always joined together to recognize a power beyond themselves. Many of these cultures express their faith through the building of magnificent monuments and structures. Churches, synagogues, temples, and mosques were not only public signs of the living faith, but these buildings served the practical purpose of gathering people together in worship. These structures were normally built from materials that were natural to the areas where they were found. Christianity came to our beloved land of enchantment in the year 1598. The first Catholic Mass was celebrated outdoors near the present site of San Juan Pueblo in northern New Mexico. Within 30 years, 25 churches had been built. Humble and simple in appearance, these structures reflected the Franciscan spirituality first brought to this area. No marble floors, no gilded ceilings. Rather, these were adobe churches, built and maintained for centuries with earth, timber, hearts, and hands. From the larger mission churches to the humbler villages, every settlement maintained a place of worship. These chapels and churches were built with handmade adobe bricks as acts of devotion by the parishioners. In most cases, the men made the adobes and built the churches, while the women plastered the exterior. Yearly maintenance was a community event, bonding the village together spiritually and providing always a sense of cultural identity. This is the church of San Jose de Gracia. Perhaps it's more popularly known as simply the beautiful old church in Trampas. This beautiful church of San Jose is one of the oldest and most perfect examples that we have, what we call colonial architecture here in New Mexico. It was built in the year 1760. When I enter this church, I can feel the spirit of the ancestors, the spirit of the people whose faith motivated them to build this beautiful monument of adobe. Dedicated families wanted to raise this church as a gathering place for their families, their children, their grandchildren, and children of many generations. I'm impressed with the massiveness of the church, The walls are over 4 feet thick. They give me the impression that somehow this church is going to be here forever. It's been adorned generation after generation. The wonderful retablo in the back here, which is about 150 years old, and all the other artifacts, the benches, the floor itself is ancient. There is something here that reflects the faith of the people. They have made this their church. These walls have been consecrated by their presence and by the prayers of thousands of people and generations of faithful. And you and I inherit that today. We are blessed to have churches like San Jose de Gracia. Over the centuries, many of the historic churches and chapels have become endangered. One of the most effective organizations for the preservation of New Mexico's historic churches was privately organized in the 1920s. Known as the Society for the Preservation and Restoration of New Mexico Churches, this group, which included Edgar Lee Hewitt and the architect John Gaumin, worked hard to preserve and restore many of New Mexico's treasured churches. Since that time, the Archdiocese of Santa Fe has championed the cause, working closely with state agencies and local communities to preserve, to maintain, and also to restore our adobe churches. And yet the hundreds of churches and chapels throughout New Mexico are in constant need of maintenance, and many of them are in dire need of repair. In the fall of 1985, the people of northern New Mexico suffered a tragic loss: the demolition of the church of San Miguel in El Valle. Gone forever are the massive adobe walls supported by the all too familiar buttresses. Also missing is the weathered wood, the patterns shaped by colonial tools, and the aged vigas and corbels. Also missing, some say, is the spiritual presence of the builders, the ancestors of the people of El Valle. No one in New Mexico understands this tragedy more than Father Jerome Martinez y Alire.
Shortly after the collapse of the church in El Valle, we experienced the same kind of thing here in El Rito. In fact, on September 29, 1979, we experienced the collapse of one of the walls here in the church due to water damage that seeped in from groundwater. It was just a shock to the entire community, because this had been the heart of the community for so long, for over 140 years at that point. After consulting with experts and really doing some soul searching among ourselves, we decided that it was worth preserving. One old-timer told me if our ancestors had enough faith to build it between 1827 and 1832, then we have enough faith to fix it in 1979. Well, that resolve was necessary because we went through 3 years of a tremendous amount of work. But I think the one thing that allowed the people to continue through with the project through continual difficulties and more collapses and financial problems and everything else is that they began to realize that for a long time they had taken for granted this church. I mean, here they were baptized, here they were married, here they were buried. And it was central to their whole village's existence, but they had taken it for granted. They had used modern construction techniques like concrete plaster and shiny blonde paneling and everything else of that nature to make the church more modern, but at the same time to avoid the constant work that a church like this requires. Once the church began to rebuild, they began to realize that as their ancestors at one time used to come together as a community to replaster the church with mud or fix the roof, that they were retying those binds that made the community what it was. So I think that was perhaps the one key realization. I think one of the great lessons I received was that I see historic preservation of churches as nothing more than allowing one generation to speak to another generation about its faith, about its values, about the importance of community. And nowhere did I get that message more clearly across into my life was when we were working on this wall over here. We found adobes that had been made by people 150 years ago near the river and then transported by hand to this site. And we found that the entire community had been involved in the construction when on many of these old adobes, much larger than the modern day adobes, we had found the footprint of children, barefoot print of children that had been used by those early settlers to run across the top of the adobe forms to tamp the earth down into the form so that the brick would come out perfect. Well, when we discovered those, it was marvelous because it was like that little child 150 years ago could have been the great-great-grandparent of some of the people living here today. It was like that child was impelling us. This was worth building. You know, what are you going to do to preserve it? What are you going to do to make sure that it passes on to your children and your children's children? And so a few years thereafter, when the Archbishop asked me to head up a task force to see what could be done about our deteriorating historic churches, we suggested at this task force that a commission be established and that this be an interdisciplinary commission, that it have architects on there, contractors, engineers, adobe preservationists, enjarradores, mud plasterers, community people, people who had had experience in doing what the people here in El Rito did. And more than anything, the commission was trying to basically network communities so that information could be shared, so that expertise could be brought to bear on the particular problem, and that people could be educated about the need to preserve these churches. One of the things the commission has been trying to do is just say, what a tremendous treasure you have here in your midst. Yes, this church that many other people would say looks very simple and very plain and of earth and timbers made, but no, it is a treasure, a jewel in your very midst.
The Archdiocese of Santa Fe has been working very closely with both public and private groups to try to raise awareness here in New Mexico about the heritage that is ours in these ancient churches. We've worked closely with the Museum of New Mexico, with the New Mexico Community Foundation, with the Guadalupe Historic Foundation, and with other private groups that are located in parishes and communities throughout our state. And we do believe that we're making headway to raise the awareness of our people that we have treasures. We have treasures among us in the form of these historic adobe churches. We need to dedicate ourselves to their maintenance and to their preservation. The ancient churches and the tiny chapels that grace the countryside of our beloved New Mexico are a great legacy of culture and faith. They stand at the center of our communities, and they tell a marvelous story of a way of life and the deep faith that fills the hearts and the homes of the people of our land of enchantment. It's my pleasure at this time to share a few of these stories with you.
In talking about this church, I think I would want to talk about how I feel about it, because that is personal, and one chooses usually to talk about that which is dear to you. I often walk in the door and I stop to bless myself at the fount. And somehow, when no one else is here, you're immediately in communion with all the people that have gone before you and all the people who have just left it perhaps, maybe even all the people that are yet to come. Because it's such a very special place, I think that it carries all the memories of the past and the promises of the future. I think it's that I look at the building as history personified. If history can be personified in a building, this building certainly does it. Gaspar de Villagra said something in his prologue to history that he was writing of New Mexico. He was the very first historian of New Mexico. And he speaks of history being that which brings forth all of those that are absent, and of breathing life and resurrection into those long dead. And for those that are still alive, it endows with immortality. And I think that's what this church does. When I stop to think about this church, I think about the thousands of hands that have gone into the making. You cannot, if you're a historian, you think about Fray Benito Pereiro, who first conceived the dream of this church. Whether he used plans that were just in his head or whether he used his experience and knowledge that he brought with him from Spain. You think about the few settlers that were here at the time that the church was built. And you know how hard they worked, how much labor there was, how few tools they had, and how limited the time was that they had for building. You think of the old women who knew so well how to do the work and who taught the younger women how to do it. Now, of course, we have the men doing it also. But you think about those hundreds of hands that have put a piece of adobe on the wall, smoothed it out, and worked hour after hour to do this. Throughout the years, it has been restored again and again. It has been in great disrepair at sometimes, almost ready to be condemned. And then the people rise to the need and it's restored again. And of course, it's still happening. It keeps on happening here every year. When Father Garcia first started this parish, he wrote a beautiful article called Symphony in Mud. And he speaks at that time, in that particular essay, that restoration in 1937 was the 14th restoration. I don't know how he knows that, but it's very interesting to note it, to see that it had already had many restorations, and it continued throughout the years. Lately, when I have been here and have been taking part in what we do, I feel that no one can really imagine the number of people who come and participate. I was looking at a list of the people who come, and we have 100 names on one sheet of paper, and we have 9 sheets of paper at least. It is truly a commitment of everybody's working together. And when we finish, there's nothing more beautiful than this church is when we have finished restoring it in the summer. The bits of straw gleam in the sunshine. You want to touch it. You want to move up and put your hands on it. And when you do, you almost feel that there's a pulse in it, it's beating with the hundreds of heartbeats of the people who have laid their hands upon it. It's very hard work, and I do sometimes feel that we romanticize it, and we think it's so easy to do. It's very hard work, but it brings us together. It really does. And I think that our love and our pride for this church will keep us together for a long time. Look real happy.
Well, it is. Well, it's a wonderful church to look at. Happy about it.
The history on the chapel is it was built in the early 20s. My great-grandfather and his family and other community members were having to have Mass said in their private homes. So my great-grandfather donated the property and they built the chapel. Then in 1937, I believe, the federal government decided to turn this valley into Indian reservations. But my great-grandfather, apparently having some foresight, had deeded this property to the archdiocese. So the chapel, the property around the chapel, stayed with the archdiocese, but it was abandoned. And it wasn't until back in the early 80s, late 70s, that we started having our family reunions, that we saw what neglect had done to the chapel, where there were holes in the walls, the ceilings were caving in, the roof was totally deteriorated. And great aunts, my grandmother, my mother, different relatives kept wishing that someday somebody would start a restoration on it. Driving along the highway, my mother would be sitting in the car with me and she would say, I would love to see the Sagrada Familia Chapel restored. And I never forgot it. I guess I can only say it in that it was an expression of love on my part. I'm one that cannot say I love you on a daily basis. I want to show it. So I made a commitment to my mom and I said, we'll get it restored. And this was after the Community Foundation had already come on and we were seeing things accomplished. The restoration of the chapel has really helped to bring the family even much closer together. We're a very close-knit family. If we hear that a distant relative needs some type of help, the family's always there to help out. But by being here together, it symbolizes really the closeness that we are. My great aunts show up every Saturday. One of them literally comes in prepared to do work. The other one comes to see if any of her children are here. But the encouragement and the enthusiasm that they give us and seeing the appreciation about having it done, recalling and being able to reminisce with us when they were children living here and using the chapel just keeps us going.
This is a dream that came up. True. This is not the end of it. We'll keep on. Our children will do it. We did it. Our parents did it. We did it. Our children will do it. And all of them will be here. To see these people, my nephews, my nieces, working, building, making windows when I didn't know they knew carpentry, building doors, building walls. Oh, it's a feeling that I wish everybody would get it, because it is unreal. It's beautiful. This was falling apart. And look at it.
During the course of the restoration, not a single moment goes by when you're not thinking about grandma or grandpa or mom. And you set that adobe brick on the wall, and occasionally you even get that lump in your throat or the tear coming down your eye. I knew my great-grandmother as a little boy, and she was a very loving and wonderful lady. But knowing that she had a part in building this church initially, and now myself as her great-grandson having something to do with the restoration of it, just gives one such a deep sense of love, which is, it permeates through our whole family.
Ready? Sagrado Corazón de Jesús, 4 cosas hoy te pido con mucha necesidad. Paciencia para sufrir, fuerza para trabajar las penas que me has de dar, entendimiento sereno para poder arreglar las cosas con santa calma, así sentir en el alma perfecta tranquilidad. Esto tengo que rogarte, oh mi Jesús adorado, en este día consagrado para servirte y amarte. Amén.
Amen.
Who brought the hot chocolate?
One of the things that really impressed me about building this church is that as we were getting near to its completion, everybody wanted to have their input into it. We had people who carved the altar, other people who carved the front doors. We had other people who wove the rugs, people who redid the paint on the statues. It seemed like everybody wanted to put their autograph on this church. what struck me about that was that everybody has something to offer. The old-timers had their wisdom and their pacing. The young guys had their strength. The women oftentimes would make the mud. They would provide the cooking. The children would help with the plastering. It seemed like everybody has a place, has something to contribute to preserve these churches. These were churches built by the people for the people. And as each adobe is important only in its relationship to another adobe and bonded together to form a wall. And even as that adobe requires the foundation so that it can be strong, and then the adobe supports the woodwork, the corbelling, the vigas on top, so it is with everybody's effort.
I had helped my father as a young child to build adobe walls, to do mud plastering, to do some minor carpentry work, but I had never attempted it on my own as an adult. But in the restoration here, they show you that the need is there to be done, and you do the best you can. It might come out a little crooked, but the sense of accomplishment of being able to say later on, hey, I did this, does give you a sense of pride.
The church contains, really it contains all the dreams and the visions. I think of the wedding couples who march up this aisle, and with them they have all their hopes and their plans for the future. And then I think of all the ones who walk behind a coffin because some loved one has died, and so they go down the aisle with him, and you have that great sense of loss. It contains all of that. It contains the sighs and the needs of all the people who come to light a candle and to pray. It contains so much that one really doesn't have enough words for it.
Partial funding for the production of Colores is provided by the Metropolitan Life Foundation and the New Mexico Arts Division. For a videocassette copy of this Colores program, send $29.95 plus $3 for shipping and handling to KNME-TV, 1130 University Boulevard Northeast, Albuquerque, New Mexico, 87102, or call 1-800-328-5663.